He has the physique of a knight in shining armor. He is so hot, he could start a 3-alarmer just from the sparks that fly when you look in his eyes. He is so handsome that he has the capacity to just hold your hand and steal away your chastity. Who is this man, you may ask? Well, it's no surprise. His name is Daily Solutions, and he's on the rise.
All right.
Hey, everybody.
Hello.
This is Ashkahn.
I am Graham.
And we have a question for you.
which is of your, I think they meant if, of your float center loses power for an extended period of days, what do you do to keep the float tanks from cooling down too much and the salt from crystallizing?
Okay, a few days. So
Yep.
This is like
Yeah.
natural disaster sort of category.
Yeah. And we do have another podcast that covers a little bit of salt crystallization,
Yeah,
but
temperature control.
but actually just having your power go down for a few days is a pretty precise question, so maybe worth going over. Panic, first of all, just panic.
Yeah,
Run around,
get out of there.
scream.
Well, there's one main solution.
So let's talk about because there's one main solution
that I know that I think about.
Well,
doing.
so you either know your power is going to go down ahead of time, or it spontaneously happens.
Right.
And I guess the solution could be the same for.
But no one
for both of
knows their
those.
power is going to go down for like 3 days. That's extremely unusual.
Well, if they're doing like work or scheduled like
For,
they're
like,
replacing
3
like a
days.
transformer.
Every time I've ever heard of someone losing power for that length of time, it's because like crazy shit is going down.
Yeah, and so at some point, if you know it's going to be down for a few days, then your solution becomes a little more apparent. But if at each moment you're expecting the power to suddenly come back on, that gets a little more.
I mean, so I'm guessing that this like something crazy is happening and like you've lost power and usually the city will be like, we're not even close to having this back. And the problem is that the longer you wait, like the more your water cools, the more you're going to get close to the saturation point. Because the saturation point's based off the temperature of your water. The warmer the water is, the more salt you can dissolve into it. And we're pretty much right below the saturation point at float tank temperature. So when the temperature drops and there's the same amount of salt in there, you cross the saturation point and the salt starts to crystallize. And literally it'll start crystallizing in your pipes. It'll start crystallizing around your pump equipment, like around the impeller in your pump.
Your entire pump will just become one solid piece, essentially, eventually. And
after long, you'll just start to grow salt crystals on the bottom of your float tank, which looks super cool, but you won't be thinking that when it's happening to you.
Yeah, it doesn't really cross most people's minds when that's what's occurring.
So there's the kind of the easiest solution is to, if the problem is that your water is too salty and that's why it's crystallizing because now you're at a lower temperature, one solution is to make your water less salty.
Yeah, and then the other solution would be to figure out a way to keep it at temperature, regardless.
Yeah, so making your water less salty unfortunately costs money because what you're going to have to do is dilute it down. So at some point, you're either going to just put more water into it to begin with and get your float tank up to like 14 inches or something like that and have it low enough specific gravity, probably like 1.2 or lower, to not be at saturation even at room temperature. And that way you won't hit the crystallization point. Or, and then once you want to get your float tank back up and running, you're going to have to drain some of that water, a good amount of it, and then add more salt in to get it back to normal. Or you could start by draining some and adding water in so your float tank's at like a more normal height, but at a right specific gravity. I guess there is a third solution other than keeping it heated and diluting, which is just to let it happen. And
What? Yeah, it's kind of a hassle to deal with.
It's a hassle, but it would cost a lot less money than diluting.
Oh, maybe if you don't take into account
if you were able to if you were able to get it back to the point, because if you have power again, you probably don't want to kick your float tank's heaters back on because they're going to get real hot sitting right up against the salt that's crystallized on your tank. But assuming that you don't kick your float tank's heaters on and you use like an aquarium probe heater or something to get the water back to being warm, and then you get someone inside the float tank to crunch up some of that salt. And like, I'm just saying it's possible. It's possible to save some money and add a bunch of labor and redissolve crystallized salt back into a float tank if you want to.
Redoing it from the pump is also just a huge hassle. Like getting the salt that's crystallized inside. I mean, we're talking about hours of labor probably going into this.
But it's one option that's on the table for people.
Sure, just selling your entire center is an option too. Yeah, just get rid of the thing, you know? Obviously, you've realized what a hassle it is running a float tank by now. Just ditch it. Sell the salt crystals on the street, you know?
All right, so you can dilute your float tank down.
Or you could wheel in some kind of generator, or if one of your neighbors has power and you don't, you could, in the dead of night, sneak over and plug in an extension cord and run some aquarium heaters in your shop.
Yeah, so they make these like aquarium. They're just like these big heating sticks that you could plug in and put into one of your float tanks and to be able to keep the temperature up.
Yeah, and if you do go with the aquarium heater route, they have ones that are surrounded by nice sheaths, so it won't the heater won't come in direct contact with any parts of your float tank, stuff like that. So be sure you're not just using the cheapest thing that you can buy, but you're making sure that as you're heating the water, you're not also like melting the fiberglass or gel coat or anything.
I think they're like $100 for like the nice ones.
Yeah.
But you'd still have to make sure the water in your pipes and pump and filter and all that stuff's going to still get cold in that scenario.
Yeah, so that means either having your tanks on a timer that is going off at least twice a day, or
you'd have to like get your float tank plugged into the whole generator system
true.
thing.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
So you wouldn't have. I guess you're probably not doing that. So you can.
You might just want to close the ball valves on your filtration system, drain everything out of that.
Yeah,
part
that
so
actually might
crystallize.
That might be the best option that you have for that one, especially your pump, just draining out the salt water and rinsing it out with fresh water before all this happens.
Yeah.
And I guess that's it, right? It's either you can stop your tank from losing temperature, or you can dilute down the water.
Yeah, you could totally drain your float tank.
I had one more thought about this too, which is something that we've definitely done in the past, which is if the plan is to dilute things, it might just be that your tank has gone a while without being changed, or one of your float tanks has, and you just want to fully take this as an excuse to fully drain and change the water. And if you're doing that, if you have multiple float tanks and you're doing that with just one tank, then you can fully drain one tank and then dilute all of the other tanks and kind of even throw some of that diluted water into your extra tank that you have left over and save a little bit of money that way.
Yeah.
So, again, it might just be a good excuse to think about what you want to do with the water overall. It's like the worst time for this to happen is when everything is totally fresh and you absolutely, you just changed float tank water, and now if you dilute it down, you're just going to be throwing a certain amount of money down the drain. But yeah, I think that's the best option you have. Also, you will still need to maintain your disinfection levels in there, so be sure that you have someone going in and actually dosing your hydrogen peroxide, or making sure that you still have some chlorine readings or whatever you're doing.
Yeah, and you'll probably want to, if you have UV or something, do like a few hours of filtration after you get things back on board.
Yeah, for sure. Pay very close attention to what happens when you're getting your tanks back up. It's amazing how quick just leaving a tank totally uncared for, and especially diluted down when you don't have that same concentration of harsh salt for other organisms. Things can just get a little funky in there. So pay attention to it and don't think you can just sort of leave this, if 3 days turns into a week or something like that. You still want to be going into the shop and taking care of your tanks, even though you're not running floats or don't have power there.
Yeah, good luck. That sounds like a rough situation.
Yeah, hopefully this wasn't just a disaster that spontaneously occurred, but it's kind of hard to imagine a scenario where it's not. So yeah, good luck. And if you have your own questions, go over to floattanksolutions.com/podcast and ship them our way.
That's right. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Bye, everyone.